Heading to his wedding reception, the millionaire entered a mall and saw his ex with a little boy that shocked him. The cafe inside Lakeside Mall buzzed with quiet evening energy. Cups clinked softly against saucers. A barista called out drink orders while families moved between tables. Nothing about the scene suggested that a man's entire future was about to pause for a single sentence. At a small table near the window, a little boy stirred marshmallows into his hot chocolate with great concentration. Across from him sat his mother. "Careful," she said gently. "If you stir too fast, it will spill." "I'm doing it slowly," the boy replied proudly. A few steps away, a tall man in a tailored suit had just stopped walking. Vance Keebler had only stepped inside the mall for a moment of quiet before heading to his wedding reception. But then the boy suddenly looked up. His eyes widened slightly as he stared at the man standing near the cafe entrance. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she glanced down at him. "Yes?" The boy pointed directly toward Vance. "Isn't that the man from the picture?" The words were simple, but they landed like a sudden jolt. Vance stopped breathing for a second. His eyes shifted from the boy to the woman sitting across from him. Hattie Rutherford. 5 years had passed since he had last seen her, yet there was no mistaking her. Her brown hair was tied loosely behind her head, and the same gentle expression he remembered still rested in her eyes. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then realization reached her face. "Vance?" His voice came out quieter than he expected. "Hi, Hattie." The boy looked back and forth between them. "You know each other?" he asked. Hattie took a small breath before answering. "Yes, we knew each other a long time ago." Vance felt something shift in his chest hearing those words. A long time ago. That was one way to describe the life they had once shared. The boy studied Vance carefully. Children have a way of noticing details adults overlook. His eyes moved from Vance's polished shoes to the crisp jacket to the carefully tied tie. "You look very fancy," the boy announced. Vance gave a soft laugh. "I guess today is a fancy day." The boy leaned forward with interest. "Are you important?" Addie gave a small embarrassed smile. "Oliver." But Vance shook his head kindly. "It's okay." He crouched slightly so he could speak at the boy's level. "What's your name?" "Oliver," the boy said proudly. "That's a strong name," Vance replied. Oliver tilted his head. "What's your name?" "Vance." Oliver nodded thoughtfully as if storing the information away. Then his eyes brightened with sudden curiosity. "Are you getting married today?" The question caught Vance off guard. He glanced briefly toward Hattie before answering. "Yes," he said slowly. "Actually, I am." Oliver's face lit up with excitement. "Weddings are happy," he declared. "That's what my mommy says." Vance gave a faint smile. "Your mom is right." Oliver looked at him again, studying his expression carefully. "But you don't look very happy." The honesty of the statement made Hattie press her lips together. "Oliver," she said softly, "sometimes grown-ups are just tired." But Oliver wasn't convinced. He looked directly at Vance. "Is the party fun?" Vance hesitated. "It hasn't started yet." "Why not?" "Because," Vance said gently, "I'm not there." Oliver considered this information carefully. Then he asked a kind of question only a child would ask. "So, why are you here instead?" Vance didn't have a clear answer. He had been on his way to a celebration that hundreds of guests were waiting to attend. Music, speeches, champagne, a carefully planned evening that was supposed to mark the beginning of his new life. Yet somehow he had asked his driver to stop at a shopping mall without fully understanding why. Now he stood inside a cafe staring at a woman from his past, and a boy who seemed strangely comfortable talking to him. "Sometimes," Vance said thoughtfully, "people need a small break before something big happens." Oliver nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My mommy says that too." Hattie looked down at the table for a moment. Vance noticed the small smile she tried to hide. Even after all these years, she still had the same calm presence he remembered. Then Oliver spoke again. "But Mommy keeps your picture in a box." The words landed gently, but their meaning carried weight. Vance looked at Hattie. "What picture?" Hattie sighed quietly. "Oliver," she said, "that box wasn't meant to be explored." "But I was curious," he replied innocently. He turned back toward Vance. "There's a picture of you in it." Vance felt his heartbeat pick up slightly. "A picture of me?" Oliver nodded. "You look younger in it." Hattie closed her eyes for a brief second before opening them again. "Vance," she said carefully, "maybe we should talk for a moment." Before he could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A message from his best man, Mitchell. "Everyone's waiting at the reception. Where are you?" Vance slowly lowered the phone. The reception, the celebration, the future he had spent years building. Yet somehow, in the middle of a busy mall cafe, everything suddenly felt uncertain, because standing in front of him was the woman who had believed in him before success ever arrived, and sitting beside her was a boy who somehow recognized him from a photograph. Sometimes the biggest turning points in life do not happen in grand boardrooms or crowded celebrations. They happen quietly, in ordinary places, a cafe table, a child's curious question, a moment when the past unexpectedly steps into the present. At that moment, Vance Keebler had no idea that the next few minutes would force him to question everything he thought he wanted. His wedding reception was waiting, his guests were celebrating, but right in front of him stood a piece of his life he had never fully left behind, and the small boy who had just pointed at him might know more about that past than Vance was ready to hear. Before we continue this powerful story, welcome to Mr. Williams' Storytime. If you enjoy meaningful stories about life, love, and unexpected second chances, make sure you subscribe and join this growing community. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from today? Now, let's go back 5 years. 5 years earlier, most people in Chicago had never heard the name Vance Keebler. Now it carried weight. Business magazines mentioned him in articles about young entrepreneurs changing the technology industry. Investors spoke about him with admiration. Former classmates who once overlooked him now proudly claimed they had known him before success arrived. At 32, Vance had built something remarkable. His company, Keebler Systems, had grown from a cramped workspace into a respected technology firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Offices stretched across several floors of a modern building overlooking the Chicago River. Teams of engineers worked on software used by companies across the country. To the outside world, Vance Keebler represented achievement, hard work, determination, and the promise that a single idea could transform an ordinary life into an extraordinary one. On the afternoon of his wedding day, that success had been on full display. The ceremony took place in an old stone church just outside the city. Tall stained glass windows filtered warm light across rows of polished wooden pews. White flowers lined the aisle, and soft music from a string quartet floated gently through the room as guests arrived. Many of them were business partners. Others were investors, friends from college, family members who had watched Vance chase his ambitions for years. When Lydia entered the church, a quiet wave of admiration moved through the room. She looked elegant in a long ivory dress, her posture confident and graceful as she walked toward the altar. Lydia Hawthorne came from a well-known Chicago family. She had studied international business, managed several successful investment projects, and carried herself with a calm authority that impressed almost everyone she met. Standing beside Vance, she looked exactly like the partner people expected a successful man to marry. The ceremony moved smoothly, the vows were exchanged. Guests applauded warmly when the officiant announced them as husband and wife. Photographs were taken outside under the bright afternoon sky. From every angle, the day looked flawless. But inside Vance's mind, something felt strangely distant. While guests congratulated the newly married couple, Vance smiled politely and shook hands. He thanked people for attending. He listened to compliments about the ceremony. Yet his thoughts drifted in ways he didn't fully understand. Standing beside Lydia, he noticed how easily she spoke with the investors who had helped fund his company. They discussed expansion plans, new partnerships, future opportunities. At one point, Lydia turned to him with a confident smile. "Your investors are already asking about the next phase of the company," she said. Vance nodded. "That sounds about right." She touched his arm lightly. "Success never waits." Her tone was warm, but her words carried the same focus she brought to every business decision. Lydia had always admired Vance's ambition. It was one of the reasons they had grown close over the past 2 years. Yet sometimes he wondered if their relationship had been built more on shared goals than shared feelings. The thought crossed his mind only briefly. Then someone else approached to congratulate them, and the moment passed. After the ceremony ended, guests began heading toward the reception venue downtown. The event planners had arranged a beautiful evening celebration inside a large event center near the river. Music, dinner, and speeches were scheduled for later that evening. Vance and Lydia would arrive separately. She was staying behind briefly with family members while photographers finished capturing additional pictures. Meanwhile, Vance stepped into the back seat of a sleek black car waiting outside the church. His driver, a polite man named Gerald, adjusted the rearview mirror. "Congratulations, sir," Gerald said with a respectful nod. "Thank you," Vance replied. The car eased onto the highway, joining the steady flow of afternoon traffic heading toward the city. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Vance loosened his tie slightly and leaned back in the seat. Outside the window, the skyline of Chicago slowly grew larger. Tall buildings reflected the late afternoon sunlight, creating flashes of gold and silver between moving cars. It was a view he had seen hundreds of times. Yet today it looked slightly different. Gerald eventually spoke again. "Everything prepared for the reception tonight?" "Yes," Vance said. From what I heard earlier, it sounds impressive. Vance nodded. The planners had been working on it for months. He knew exactly what awaited him. Long tables covered with white linen, carefully arranged floral decorations. A live band scheduled to begin playing once dinner ended. A large screen prepared to display photos from his life and career. Even a custom cake designed to resemble the skyline of Chicago. Every detail had been organized perfectly. Hundreds of guests would soon gather to celebrate the beginning of his marriage. Yet instead of excitement, Vance felt a strange stillness settling over his thoughts. He watched the city pass by through the tinted window. People walked along sidewalks carrying shopping bags. Couples crossed intersections holding hands. A group of teenagers laughed while sharing a slice of pizza on the corner. Life moved normally all around him, simple, unplanned, unscheduled. For reasons he couldn't explain, those ordinary scenes held his attention longer than the celebration waiting ahead. "Sir," Gerald said after a few minutes, "we're about 20 minutes from the reception venue." Vance nodded, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he continued watching the streets outside. Cars passed slowly through an intersection. A city bus stopped to pick up passengers. On the right side of the road, a large shopping center appeared between two office buildings. Lakeside Mall. Vance had visited it years earlier when his company's first office had been nearby. Without thinking much about it, he spoke. "Gerald." "Yes, sir?" "Pull over at that mall entrance." The driver looked slightly surprised. "The mall, sir?" "Yes." Gerald checked the mirror briefly. "Is everything all right?" "I just need a few minutes," Vance said calmly. The driver nodded. "Of course." The car turned into the wide entrance leading toward the shopping center parking area. When the car stopped near the entrance, Vance stepped out. Cool air brushed against his face as he straightened his jacket. Inside the mall, glass doors opened and closed as people walked in and out carrying shopping bags. Gerald lowered the window. "Take your time, sir," he said. "I'll be right here." Vance nodded. "Thank you." He walked through the entrance and into the wide hallway of the mall. Bright lights reflected off polished floors. Stores displayed clothing, electronics, and books behind large glass windows. Families moved between shops. Children laughed near a toy store farther down the corridor. The environment felt relaxed and ordinary, completely different from the formal atmosphere of the wedding ceremony earlier that afternoon. For the first time all day, Vance felt like he could breathe normally. Just a few minutes to clear his mind before heading to the reception. So he began walking slowly through the mall corridor. He passed a bookstore, then a clothing store, then a cafe near the center of the mall, and that's when he heard it. A laugh, soft, warm, familiar. It wasn't loud, but it carried clearly above the quiet hum of conversations around him. Vance stopped walking. Some sounds stay in memory longer than we expect. Even after years pass, even after lives change, that laugh was one of them. Slowly, almost cautiously, Vance turned his head toward the cafe. And there she was, Hattie Rutherford, sitting at a small table near the window, helping a little boy stir marshmallows into a cup of hot chocolate. 5 years had passed since the last time Vance saw her. But in that single moment, the past stepped directly into the present, and everything that had seemed so certain earlier that day suddenly felt much less clear. For several seconds, Vance didn't move. The hallway behind him remained busy. Shoppers walked past carrying bags. A child ran ahead of his parents toward a toy store, laughing loudly. But the noise around Vance faded into the background. His attention rested completely on the small table near the cafe window. Slowly, she said with a soft smile, "If you rush, the marshmallows will disappear." The boy laughed. "That's the best part." Hattie shook her head, amused. "You're supposed to drink the chocolate too, Oliver." The boy grinned. "I will." Vance heard the name clearly. Oliver. He repeated it quietly in his mind without realizing it. 5 years. 5 full years had passed since he had last spoken to Hattie. Yet watching her now felt strangely familiar. The same calm way she spoke, the same gentle patience in her voice, the same warmth that had once made long nights feel easier. Vance hadn't planned to see her again. In truth, he had assumed he never would. But there she was, only a few steps away. As Vance stood there, memories surfaced naturally. He remembered a small apartment filled with books and music, late evenings walking along the river, the sound of Hattie laughing when he told terrible jokes after working too long at the office. Back then, life had been simple. Uncertain, yes, but simple. No investors, no interviews, no headlines about young entrepreneurs. Just a young man with a dream, and a woman who believed in him. Now the situation felt completely different. He wore a suit tailored by one of Chicago's most respected designers. His phone carried messages from executives and investors waiting for his arrival at a wedding reception. And yet, in the middle of all that success, Seeing Hattie again created a quiet feeling he hadn't expected. Something thoughtful, something unfinished. Vance was about to step away. Part of him wondered if it would be better not to interrupt. 5 years had changed both their lives. Maybe it would be easier to simply leave. But before he could turn around, the boy suddenly looked up. Oliver's eyes landed directly on him. For a moment, the child simply studied him. Children are naturally curious, especially when something unusual appears in their environment. A man standing alone in a formal suit inside a shopping mall definitely qualified. Oliver leaned slightly toward his mother. "Mommy," he whispered. Hattie was still looking down at the table. "Yes?" The boy pointed. "Isn't that the man from the picture?" Hattie looked up. Her eyes followed the direction of Oliver's finger. The moment she saw Vance, her expression changed instantly. Surprise reached her face first, then recognition. For a brief moment she didn't speak. Vance stepped closer, unsure whether to smile or simply nod. Finally she said his name quietly. "Vance?" He gave a small nod. "Hi, Hattie." The boy looked back and forth between them. "You know each other?" he asked with clear curiosity. Hattie placed her hand gently on Oliver's shoulder. "Yes," she said calmly. "We knew each other a long time ago." The phrase carried a quiet weight. Vance understood exactly what she meant. A long time ago. Before companies grew. Before life changed direction. Before silence replaced conversations. Oliver continued studying Vance carefully. Children often speak with a kind of honesty adults learn to filter over time. His eyes moved from Vance's polished shoes to the jacket, then to the neatly tied tie. "You look very fancy," Oliver said. Vance smiled slightly. "I guess I do." The boy leaned forward with interest. "Are you important?" Hattie sighed softly. "Oliver," but Vance raised a hand gently. "It's all right." He crouched slightly so he was closer to the boy's height. "Well," Vance said thoughtfully, "today is an important day." Oliver's eyes widened. "Why?" Vance hesitated for a second before answering. "Because I'm getting married." Oliver's face lit up immediately. "Really?" Vance nodded. "Yes." The boy clapped his hands once in excitement. "Weddings are happy," he announced proudly. "My mommy told me." Hattie gave him a patient smile. "Yes, I did." Oliver looked back at Vance again. "But you don't look happy." The comment arrived so naturally that it caught both adults off guard. Hattie cleared her throat. "Oliver, sometimes people are just thinking about many things at once," but Oliver wasn't finished, observing. He tilted his head slightly. "Are you going to the party now?" "Yes," Vance said slowly. "The reception is starting soon." "Then why are you here?" Oliver asked. The question was innocent, but surprisingly difficult to answer. Vance thought about it for a moment. Then he gave the most honest reply he could. "I needed a small break first." Oliver nodded, as if that explanation made perfect sense. "My mommy takes breaks too," he said, "especially when I ask too many questions." Hattie laughed quietly. "You asked exactly the right number of questions." Watching Hattie interact with the boy revealed something new about her. There was a calm confidence in the way she spoke, the same warmth Vance remembered, but deeper now. Motherhood had softened certain edges of her personality. At the same time, it had clearly made her stronger. Oliver reached for another marshmallow floating in his drink. "Careful," Hattie warned. "You already had 3. "But they're small," Oliver argued. "They're supposed to be," she replied. Vance found himself smiling at the exchange. For a brief moment, the entire scene felt strangely peaceful, almost like a snapshot from a different version of life, one where time had moved in a different direction. Then Oliver spoke again. "Mommy has your picture," he said casually. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Vance blinked. "My picture?" Oliver nodded enthusiastically. "Yes," Hattie inhaled slowly. "Oliver." But the boy continued talking. "It's in a box in her closet." He turned back toward Vance. "You look younger in it." Vance looked toward Hattie, confused but curious. "A box?" Hattie closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. "It's just an old memory box," she said quietly. Oliver shrugged. "I found it last week." He smiled proudly as if discovering it had been a great adventure. There were lots of pictures in there. Then he pointed again. "And you were in one of them." Before Vance could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message appeared on the screen. "Mitchell, everyone's here. Lydia's asking where you are." Vance stared at the message for a moment. Across from him sat the woman who had once stood beside him during the hardest years of his life. Beside her sat a young boy who somehow recognized him from a photograph hidden in a memory box. The reception hall across the city was filled with guests celebrating his marriage. But standing here, in a simple cafe inside a shopping mall, something felt unexpectedly important. Vance slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked at Hattie. What kind of picture was it? Hattie hesitated before answering. The silence between them stretched for a moment. Finally, she said quietly, "Maybe we should talk." 5 years earlier, Vance Keebler's life looked very different. There were no interviews, no investors flying in from other cities, no luxury offices with glass walls overlooking the Chicago River. Back then, Vance worked in a small rented room above a neighborhood bakery on the north side of the city. The space had once been used for storage, and it still carried the faint smell of fresh bread drifting up from the kitchen downstairs. His desk was crowded with computer monitors, tangled cables, and stacks of notebooks filled with ideas. Empty coffee cups gathered in corners after long nights of work. The heating system rattled loudly in winter, and in the summer the small window fan struggled to keep the room cool. But none of that mattered to Vance. Because to him, that cramped office wasn't just a workspace, it was the starting point of a dream. Most evenings the bakery downstairs closed around 7. After the last customer left, the street outside grew quiet. That was when Vance worked best. He sat at his desk writing lines of code, adjusting software models, and sketching new ideas in a notebook he carried everywhere. Sometimes he worked until 2 or 3 in the morning. Other nights he simply lost track of time. His friends often asked why he pushed himself so hard. But Vance had always been driven by a simple belief. If the idea he was building worked, it could change everything. Still, those early months were not easy. Funding was uncertain. His equipment was secondhand, and there were days when the software refused to cooperate no matter how many times he rewrote the code. On those nights, frustration crept in, and doubt quietly followed. But there was one person who never allowed those doubts to stay very long. Around 9 o'clock most evenings, the narrow staircase leading up to Vance's office would creak softly. Then the door would open. Hattie Rutherford would step inside carrying a paper bag from the bakery downstairs. "You forgot to eat again," she would say with a playful sigh. Inside the bag were usually 2 things, a sandwich and coffee. Vance would lean back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "You're becoming very predictable," he would joke. Hattie would set the food on his desk. "And you're becoming very unhealthy." She would glance around the cluttered room. "You've been here all day again, haven't you?" Vance would shrug. Almost, she would shake her head and pull a chair closer to his desk. "Well," she'd say, opening the sandwich wrapper, "at least take 10 minutes to eat something before you try to invent the future." Despite the teasing tone, there was genuine care in her voice, and those small visits meant more to Vance than he ever admitted. One evening, after several hours of frustrating work, Vance closed his laptop with a tired sigh. "I think this whole thing might be impossible," he muttered. Hattie looked up from the book she had been reading while waiting for him to finish. "What makes you say that?" "The system keeps crashing every time I try to scale the network model." "That sounds complicated," she admitted. "It is." Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm wasting years chasing something that might never work." Hattie studied him for a moment. Then she closed her book and stood up. Walking around the desk, she placed her hands gently on his shoulders. "Look at me," she said. Vance glanced up. "You're going to succeed one day." He gave a tired smile. "You sound very confident about that." "I am." "How?" Hattie thought for a moment before answering. "Because you don't quit. That's not always a good thing." "It is when your heart believes in something," she replied. Her voice carried a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't come from wishful thinking, but from genuine faith in another person. When Vance finally finished working for the night, the two of them often walked toward the Chicago River. The streets were calm by that hour. Street lights reflected softly on the water, and the city felt quieter than it did during the busy daytime hours. Sometimes they talked about the future. Other times they simply walked without saying much. One evening they sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the water. Hattie leaned her head lightly against Vance's shoulder. "You know something?" she said. "What?" "One day you're going to have a huge office somewhere in this city." Vance laughed quietly. "And how exactly do you know that?" "Because you never stop trying. That's not exactly a guarantee. It's the closest thing to one." Vance looked down at her. "You really believe in me that much?" Hattie didn't hesitate. "Even more than you believe in yourself." The sentence was simple, but it stayed with him long after that evening ended. Back then, their plans for the future were modest. They talked about renting a slightly larger apartment someday, maybe taking a trip to California once the company began making money. Nothing extravagant, just small goals built on patience and effort. One night, Vance closed his laptop earlier than usual. Hattie looked surprised. "You're done already." "For today, that might be a historical moment," she joked. Vance leaned back in his chair. "I was thinking about something. Should I be worried?" "Probably not." He looked around the small office. You've spent a lot of time supporting this crazy project. I don't think it's crazy. You might change your mind if it fails. Hattie smiled. I'm not worried about that. Why not? Because if it fails, she said calmly, you'll just start again. As months passed, small signs of progress began appearing. A technology blog wrote a short article about Vance's software. Then a few small companies started testing the system. Emails from potential investors began arriving. At first, they were brief inquiries, but gradually the conversations became more serious. One afternoon, Vance rushed into the apartment he shared with Hattie, holding his phone. You won't believe this, he said breathlessly. She looked up from the kitchen. What happened? A venture capital firm in California wants to talk. Her eyes widened. That sounds important. It is. Vance ran a hand through his hair. They want to see a full demonstration of the platform. Hattie smiled. Well then, I guess you should show them. Her confidence in that moment felt natural, but neither of them realized how quickly that opportunity would change everything. The meeting with the California investors went better than Vance expected. They were impressed with his technology. They saw potential where others had only seen risk, but they also had one condition. To receive their funding, Vance would need to relocate and build the company from their headquarters in California. The offer arrived during a phone call late one evening. Vance sat at his desk, listening carefully. When the call ended, he remained silent for several seconds. Hattie noticed the expression on his face. What did they say? Vance looked at her slowly. They want to fund the company. Her face lit up with excitement. That's amazing, but... She waited. They want me to move. The room grew quiet. Hattie processed the information slowly. Move where? She asked. California. For how long? They didn't say exactly, Vance admitted. But if the company grows, it could be several years. Hattie nodded thoughtfully. That's a big step. It's the opportunity I've been waiting for, Vance said. I know. He walked closer to her. You could come with me. Hattie didn't answer right away. She looked around their small apartment. The familiar furniture, the photographs on the wall, the life they had quietly built together. Then she looked back at him. My life is here, Vance. Our life could be somewhere new, he said gently. Hattie offered a soft smile. Everything is happening very fast. Vance reached for her hand. This is the dream we talked about. Hattie looked at him with calm honesty. Your dream. The words weren't harsh. They weren't angry. They were simply true. And neither of them realized that this single moment would begin a distance that time would only widen. The days following the investor's offer passed quickly. Vance spent most of his time reviewing documents, answering emails, and preparing the next steps for his company. Calls with the California investors became more frequent, each one bringing new plans and expectations. The opportunity was real, more real than anything he had imagined during those long nights in the small office above the bakery. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork when Hattie placed a cup of tea beside him. You've been reading those papers for 3 hours, she said. Vance rubbed his eyes. They want an answer soon. How soon? 2 weeks. Hattie pulled out a chair and sat across from him. That's not much time. No, Vance admitted. He looked down at the papers again. They're offering enough funding to expand the company immediately. That's incredible. It is, he said quietly, but it means everything changes. Over the next few days, Vance talked endlessly about the possibilities, new engineers, a larger team, resources he had never been able to afford before. Hattie listened patiently. She could see the excitement in his eyes each time he explained another idea, and she truly wanted to be happy for him. But beneath that excitement was a quiet question she couldn't ignore. Where did she fit into all of this? One night, while they were washing dishes together, she finally asked, If you move there, how soon would the company start operating? Immediately, Vance replied. They want everything set up as quickly as possible, and you would be working full-time, probably more than full-time. Hattie dried her hands with a towel. So your schedule would be even busier than it is now. Vance paused. That's likely. She nodded slowly. The answer wasn't surprising, but hearing it out loud made the situation feel more real. A few nights later, Vance returned home carrying a folder filled with documents from the investors. His energy filled the room. They finalized the proposal, he said. Hattie looked up from the couch. That was fast. They're serious about this. He placed the folder on the table. They're ready to move forward as soon as I arrive. Hattie studied his expression. You sound excited. I am. He walked closer and sat beside her. Hattie, you could come with me. She blinked. To California? Yes, we'd start a completely new life there. Hattie leaned back slightly. That's a big decision, I know. He spoke with the same confidence he always carried when discussing business plans. Yet this decision involved more than business. It involved 2 lives moving in the same direction. Hattie stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the lights of the city reflected across the street. Chicago had always felt like home to her. her job, her friends, her family living only a short drive away. All of it was here. She turned back toward Vance. What would I do there? You could find work easily, he said. There are plenty of opportunities. That's not exactly what I meant. He watched her carefully. You're worried. I'm thinking. He walked toward her. Hattie, this is the chance we've been waiting for. She gave a small smile. The correction wasn't harsh, but it carried an important difference. Vance noticed it immediately. You don't believe in this opportunity? I do, she said gently. I just want to understand what it means for both of us. In the end, they decided to try something in between. Vance would move first and begin building the company with the investors. Hattie would remain in Chicago for the time being. They promised each other they would stay connected. Phone calls, video chats, visits whenever possible. At first, those plans worked. During the first few weeks after Vance moved to California, they spoke almost every evening. He told her about the new office space, the team of engineers he was assembling, the excitement surrounding the company's early growth. Hattie listened with interest. I'm proud of you, she told him during one call. You're finally seeing the results of all that hard work. Vance smiled through the screen. I couldn't have done it without you. For a while, those words still felt true. But as the months passed, Vance's schedule became increasingly demanding. Investor meetings filled his mornings. Development sessions with his engineering team stretched late into the night. Business trips took him to different cities. Sometimes he forgot to call until very late. Other times he sent quick messages explaining he would have to talk the next day. Hattie tried to be understanding. She knew how much the company meant to him. Still, the conversations gradually became shorter. What once lasted an hour turned into 15 minutes, then 10, then occasionally just a brief message. One evening, Hattie stared at her phone after sending a text. How was your day? The message remained unanswered for hours. Eventually, a reply appeared. Busy day. Talk tomorrow. She placed the phone down quietly. Something had shifted. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them felt it. At first, Vance visited Chicago every few weeks. Those weekends were special. They walked along the river again. They talked about the future. They tried to reconnect with the easy rhythm they once shared. But eventually the visits became less frequent. Business demanded more of his time. Investors expected constant progress. When Vance called to explain another canceled trip, Hattie tried to keep her voice calm. I understand, she said. I'll come as soon as things slow down. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Of course, but deep down she wondered when that moment would actually arrive. Because the company was growing faster than anyone expected, and success has a way of filling every empty space in a person's schedule. Their final conversation happened on a quiet evening in early autumn. Hattie sat at the small kitchen table with her phone pressed against her ear. Vance's voice sounded distant. Things are moving quickly here, he explained. We're opening a second office soon. That's wonderful, she said sincerely. I wish you could see it. I wish that too. A brief silence followed. Finally, Hattie spoke. Vance, when do you think you'll come back to Chicago again? He hesitated. I'm not sure. Next month, maybe? Possibly. The uncertainty in his voice was enough for her to understand the truth. His life had moved forward, in another city, in another direction. She took a small breath. Well, I'm glad things are working out for you, Hattie. You should focus on your company, she said gently. That's what you've worked for all these years. The call ended shortly afterward. Neither of them realized it would be the last time they spoke. After that evening, weeks passed. Then months, no calls, no messages. Life continued for both of them, but on separate paths. Vance became fully absorbed in building the company. The software expanded. Clients increased. Investors praised the rapid growth. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Hattie quietly adjusted to a new chapter of her life. She focused on work, she spent more time with family, and she carried forward memories of a relationship that had once meant everything. Eventually, the silence between them became normal, until 5 years later, when fate placed them face to face again, inside a mall cafe, with a small boy sitting between the past and the present. The quiet memory faded, and the present returned. Vance was still standing beside the cafe table inside Lakeside Mall. Across from him sat Hattie. Between them sat Oliver, happily finishing the last marshmallows floating in his hot chocolate. The boy seemed completely unaware that something important had just surfaced between the two adults. But Hattie understood, and Vance did too. 5 years of silence had suddenly been replaced by a moment neither of them expected. Hattie rested her hands gently on the table. It's been a long time, she said. Vance nodded. Yes, it has. The sentence sounded simple, but it carried years of distance. Oliver looked between them again. You two talk like old friends, he observed. Hattie smiled faintly. We were... Oliver slid down from his chair and stood beside the table. I'm Oliver, he announced proudly. Vance extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Oliver. The boy shook it seriously, copying the formal greeting he had probably seen adults use before. You have a very strong handshake, Vance said. Oliver grinned. My teacher says that's important. That's a smart teacher. Hattie watched the exchange quietly. Something about the way Oliver looked at Vance made her slightly nervous. Children often sense connections adults try to hide. Oliver tilted his head. Do you work in an office? Vance chuckled. Yes. A big one? Pretty big. Oliver nodded as if confirming a theory he had already formed. I knew it. As Oliver talked, Vance noticed small details. The boy's dark hair, the curious way he studied people, even the thoughtful pause he took before asking questions. Something about those habits felt strangely familiar. Vance pushed the thought aside. It was probably just coincidence. Many children shared similar traits. Still, the feeling lingered quietly in his mind. Oliver pointed toward Vance's suit again. Is that what people wear at weddings? Sometimes, Vance said. I've never been to a wedding before, Oliver admitted. They're usually fun, Vance replied. Oliver brightened immediately. Do people dance? They do. Even the grown-ups? Especially the grown-ups. Oliver laughed. That sounds funny. While Oliver chatted happily, Hattie studied Vance. The years had changed him. His posture was more confident. His clothes carried the polished look of someone used to business meetings and public events. But his eyes still held the same thoughtful expression she remembered. Chicago suits you, she said quietly. Vance looked at her. I guess it does. I've seen your name in the news a few times. That's mostly the company doing. You built it, not alone. The conversation felt polite, almost cautious. Two people reconnecting while carefully avoiding deeper questions. Oliver interrupted the moment again. Mommy, can we go to the toy store soon? In a few minutes, Hattie replied. You said that 5 minutes ago. I know. Oliver climbed back into his chair. Then he looked directly at Vance again. Are you rich? Hattie immediately covered her face with one hand. Oliver. What? He asked innocently. That's not something you ask people. Vance laughed softly. It's all right. He considered the question. I've done well with my work. Oliver nodded thoughtfully. That means yes. Hattie shook her head. I'm sorry. It's fine, Vance said. Oliver leaned forward again. So your wedding must be very big. It probably is. Lots of cake. I hope so. Oliver looked impressed. My birthday cake last year had dinosaurs on it. That sounds amazing, Vance replied. It was... The boy paused again, studying him carefully. Then he asked another question. Do you love the person you're marrying? The table grew quiet. Even Oliver seemed to sense that his question had landed somewhere serious. Vance didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Hattie. She lowered her eyes slightly. Finally, Vance spoke. Yes, he said. Oliver nodded slowly. That's good. Why do you say that? Vance asked. Because my mommy says people should only marry someone they really care about. Hattie smiled gently. I did say that. Oliver looked satisfied. Then your wedding will probably work. Vance gave a small smile. I hope so. Yet something about the conversation left him thoughtful. After a moment, Vance turned his attention back to Oliver. So, Oliver, he said casually, how old are you? The boy held up 4 fingers proudly. 4, Vance repeated. That's a great age. I can already read some words, Oliver added. That's impressive. My mommy helps me practice. Hattie gave a small nod. He's learning quickly. Vance smiled at the boy again. But inside his mind, something had quietly shifted. 4 years old. The number lingered in his thoughts. 4 years. Almost exactly the amount of time that had passed since he left Chicago. He slowly looked at Hattie. She seemed to understand the calculation forming in his mind. Her expression changed slightly. Just enough for him to notice. Oliver hopped down from his chair again. Can we go to the toy store now? He asked. Hattie looked at him kindly. Yes, sweetheart, but stay near the entrance where I can see you. Oliver nodded enthusiastically and hurried toward the nearby toy shop. For the first time since the conversation began, Vance and Hattie were alone. The cheerful sounds of the mall continued around them. But their table felt suddenly quiet. Vance spoke carefully. Hattie, yes? How old did you say Oliver was? She held his gaze for a moment. 4. The number sounded even more meaningful the second time. Vance leaned slightly closer. Hattie, is there something I should know? She looked toward the toy store where Oliver was examining a row of colorful trucks. Then she looked back at Vance. Her voice came out soft. Yes. She folded her hands together on the table. Actually, there is. Hattie watched Oliver through the glass window of the toy store. The boy had found a shelf filled with bright plastic trucks and was carefully examining each one as if deciding which vehicle was the most important invention in the world. Children could focus deeply on the smallest things. For a moment, that innocent distraction gave the two adults at the cafe table a bit of privacy. Vance leaned slightly forward. "Hattie," he said gently, "what is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept her eyes on Oliver. "You remember how curious you used to be about everything?" she asked. Vance smiled faintly. "I still am." "Well," she said softly, "Oliver inherited that trait." Vance followed her gaze toward the toy store. "I can see that." Hattie took a slow breath. He's always asking questions, always searching through things that probably weren't meant for him to discover yet. Vance's curiosity sharpened. "Like the box you mentioned earlier?" Hattie nodded slightly. "Yes, it's just a small wooden box," she explained. "Nothing special. I bought it years ago at a little shop near the river." "What's inside it?" Vance asked. "Memories," she replied quietly. The word lingered between them. "Old photographs, letters, a few small souvenirs from different moments in my life." Vance listened carefully. "And one of those photographs is me?" "Yes." She finally looked directly at him. The honesty in her voice felt calm, not dramatic, like someone simply acknowledging a chapter of life that had once mattered deeply. "I never meant for Oliver to find it," she continued, "but children are very good at discovering hidden things." Vance nodded. "That's true." Hattie folded her hands together on the table. "Last week I was cleaning the apartment while Oliver was supposed to be playing in his room." Vance smiled slightly. "That sounds like the beginning of a familiar story." "It is," she sighed softly. "When I went to check on him, he was sitting on the floor with the memory box open, and he was looking through everything, very carefully." Vance imagined the scene, a curious 4-year-old exploring objects from the past. "What did he say?" Vance asked. Hattie's expression softened. "He asked a lot of questions, I'm sure." He picked up one photograph, in particular, and asked who the man was. Vance felt a quiet tension form in his chest. "And what did you tell him?" Hattie looked down at the table. "I told him the truth." Vance waited. "I told him the man in the picture was someone who had once been very important in my life." She lifted her eyes again. Vance listened silently. Oliver's voice suddenly echoed from inside the toy store. "Mommy, look at this big fire truck." Hattie smiled toward him. "That's impressive, Oliver." Then she returned her attention to Vance. He kept studying the picture, she continued. "Children notice details adults overlook." "What kind of details?" She hesitated slightly. "The way you were smiling in that photo." Vance didn't remember many photographs from those years. Most of his time had been spent working. "What else did he notice?" he asked. Hattie took another quiet breath. "He said the man looked kind. Then he asked something I wasn't expecting," she said. "What?" Hattie's voice softened. "He asked if the man still existed." Vance frowned slightly. "Still existed?" He meant, was the person in the picture still part of the world? Vance leaned back slowly. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him yes," she said, "but I explained that sometimes people's lives move in different directions." Vance nodded quietly. "That sounds like a reasonable answer." Hattie smiled faintly. "Oliver didn't think so." "What do you mean?" He asked if the man ever came back. The words lingered between them. "And you said?" Vance asked. "I told him I didn't know." A moment passed before Vance spoke again. "So when Oliver saw me just now—" "He recognized you," Hattie finished. "Yes." From inside the toy store, Oliver ran toward the window holding the bright red fire truck he had discovered. "Mommy, this one makes siren sounds." "That's wonderful," she called back. He pressed a button. The toy made a cheerful electronic noise. Satisfied, Oliver ran back to the shelf to continue exploring. Vance watched him for a moment, then he turned back toward Hattie. "So that's why he pointed at me?" "Yes." "And asked if I was the man from the picture?" Hattie nodded slowly. "He has a very good memory." Vance rested his elbows lightly on the table. The pieces of the conversation had begun forming a larger picture in his mind. A memory box, a photograph, a curious child asking questions about someone from the past, and a boy who happened to be 4 years old. He glanced again toward the toy store. Oliver was kneeling beside a display of toy cars now, completely absorbed in choosing between 2 different models. Vance looked back at Hattie. "Hattie," he said quietly. "Yes, I need to ask you something." Her expression remained calm, but her eyes showed she already knew what the question might be. Vance spoke carefully. "When you told Oliver about the man in that photograph—" He paused briefly. "Did you tell him who I really was?" Hattie's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she said softly, "No." Vance felt the tension deepen. "Why not?" Hattie glanced once more toward Oliver. Then she looked back at Vance. "Because," she said gently, "there were things you didn't know yet." For a few quiet seconds neither of them spoke. The cafe hummed softly around them. Cups touched saucers. A group of teenagers laughed near the counter while sharing a plate of pastries. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine released a short burst of steam. But at the small table near the window, the air felt heavier. Vance studied Hattie's face. Her words had been calm, yet they carried meaning that felt unfinished. There were things you didn't know yet. The sentence echoed in his mind. "What things?" he asked gently. Hattie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced again toward the toy store entrance where Oliver was still deciding between two toy cars. Vance followed her gaze. The boy looked perfectly happy, kneeling beside the display with complete focus. Then Vance turned back to Hattie. "Hattie," he said quietly, "I think I deserve to understand what you mean." She nodded slowly. "You do." Vance leaned back slightly in his chair. He spoke carefully. "You said Oliver is 4 years old." "Yes." "When exactly did he turn 4? Hattie folded her hands together. "In April." "April. 4 years old." Vance mentally traced the timeline backward. 4 years ago, he had already been living in California, fully immersed in building the company. But before that, he had still been in Chicago, still spending evenings in the small office above the bakery, still walking along the river with Hattie. The realization moved slowly but clearly through his thoughts. Vance leaned forward again. "Hattie." She met his eyes. "Yes?" His voice was quiet now. "Is Oliver my son?" The question didn't sound dramatic. It sounded simple, but it carried the weight of years. Hattie closed her eyes briefly, not because she was surprised by the question, because she had known this moment would arrive eventually. When she opened her eyes again, they looked calm but thoughtful. "Vance," she said gently, "life became complicated after you left." He didn't interrupt. She continued slowly. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks after you moved to California." The words settled into the quiet space between them. Vance didn't move, didn't blink. For a moment he simply listened. Hattie's voice remained steady. "I wasn't expecting it. Neither of us were." Vance leaned back in his chair, absorbing the sentence. "You were pregnant." "Yes, and you never told me." Her gaze softened slightly. "No." Vance ran a hand slowly across his face. The mall around them continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. People walked past carrying shopping bags. A mother guided her toddler toward the escalator nearby. Yet at that table, time seemed to slow. "Why?" Vance asked quietly. The question carried no anger, only confusion. Hattie answered honestly, "Because of everything happening in your life at the time. My company, yes. You had finally received the opportunity you had worked for all those years." Vance looked down at the table. "You should have told me." "I thought about it many times," she admitted. "Then why didn't you?" Hattie took a slow breath. "Because I knew the kind of person you were." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means if you had known about the baby," she said softly, "you would have felt responsible for coming back. And that would have been wrong." "No," she replied, "but I didn't want your future to feel like a sacrifice." Hattie's voice remained calm. "I watched your company grow over the years." "You followed the news?" "Sometimes." Vance looked at her carefully. "And you decided to raise Oliver alone?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." "Why?" Hattie's answer came quietly. "Because I believed you deserved the life you fought for." Vance stared at her for several seconds. The idea was difficult to process. For years he had believed distance between them was simply the result of time and changing priorities. Now he realized something much larger had been hidden beneath that silence. Oliver's laughter drifted from the toy store again. The boy was testing another truck, pressing the buttons with fascination. Vance looked toward him, then back at Hattie. "So, he's really my son." Hattie held his gaze. There was no hesitation now. "Yes," she said gently. "Oliver is your son." The sentence felt surprisingly quiet. No dramatic music, no raised voices, just the truth finally spoken after years of silence. Vance exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He watched Oliver through the toy store window. The boy looked up at that exact moment and waved enthusiastically. "Mommy, this one lights up." Hattie smiled and waved back. "That's wonderful, Oliver." Vance watched the child for a long moment. 4 years, 4 years of birthdays, 4 years of first words, 4 years of moments he had never known existed. Then he looked at Hattie again. His voice was softer than before. "Does he know?" Hattie shook her head. "No, Why not? She glanced toward Oliver once more. Then she answered gently, because I didn't know if you would ever come back. Vance sat back in his chair, letting the truth settle slowly in his mind. Across the glass window of the toy store, Oliver was now pressing the buttons on a small police car, fascinated by the flashing lights. The boy laughed softly when the toy made a cheerful siren sound. For a moment, Vance simply watched him, his son. The words felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. 4 years of life, 4 years of growing up, and he had never known. He turned back toward Hattie. You raised him by yourself? She nodded gently. Yes. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't always simple, she admitted. But it was never something I regretted. Vance studied her face carefully. You never once thought about calling me? Hattie smiled faintly. More times than I can count. Hattie rested her elbows lightly on the table, remembering. I found out a few weeks after you moved to California. She paused briefly. At first I thought the doctor must be mistaken. Vance listened quietly. You were still settling into your new life there. Your company had just started growing. She looked down at her hands. I remember sitting in my car outside the clinic holding the test results. What did you think? Vance asked. That life had suddenly given me a completely different future than the one I expected. Vance remained silent. I tried to imagine calling you, she continued, trying to explain everything while you were building the company you had dreamed about for years, and every time I pictured that conversation, it felt wrong. Hattie looked back toward the toy store. Oliver had now discovered a shelf of stuffed animals and was hugging a small brown bear while examining its tag. He deserved a calm beginning, she said softly. Who did? Vance asked. Oliver, and telling me would have changed that. She nodded slightly. You would have come back. You don't know that. Hattie smiled gently. Yes, I do. Why are you so certain? Because I know the man you were back then. Vance looked down briefly. You might have been right, he admitted. If I had known, I probably would have come back immediately. And that's exactly why I didn't call. The cafe had grown slightly busier as the evening crowd moved through the mall. But at their table, the conversation remained focused. How did you manage everything? Vance asked. My job allowed flexible hours, and my parents helped when Oliver was very young. You told them about me? Yes. And what did they say? She laughed softly. They asked the same question you just did. What question? Why I didn't tell you. And your answer? Hattie thought for a moment. I told them the same thing I told you, that your future mattered too much to interrupt. Vance leaned back slowly. You made that decision entirely on your own. Yes. Without asking me, yes. The honesty in her voice wasn't defensive. It was simply truthful. Vance crossed his arms thoughtfully. You said you followed the news sometimes. Hattie nodded. Your company appeared in a few articles over the years. You read them? Sometimes. And what did you think? She smiled faintly. I thought you looked exactly like the person I always believed you would become. Vance shook his head slowly. That's strange to hear. Why? Because every time something good happened for the company, I thought about the people who helped me reach that point. And you thought about me? Yes. Hattie's expression softened. I'm glad, but I assumed you had moved on. She glanced toward Oliver again. In a way I did. Oliver suddenly ran out of the toy store, holding the stuffed bear in both hands. Mommy, look! He lifted the toy proudly. His name is Captain Bear. Hattie laughed. That's a very strong name. Oliver looked at Vance. Do you like him? Vance smiled. I think Captain Bear looks very brave. Oliver beamed. I knew it. He climbed back onto his chair and placed the bear on the table as if introducing a new member of the group. This is my friend. Vance leaned slightly forward. Nice to meet you, Captain Bear. Oliver giggled. Hattie watched the interaction quietly. For the first time since the conversation began, she saw something new in Vance's expression. Not confusion, not shock. Something softer, something thoughtful, something that looked very much like a father noticing his child. Oliver soon returned to describing all the toys he had seen in the store. Fire trucks, robots, toy airplanes. He spoke with endless enthusiasm, occasionally asking Vance if he liked each one, and Vance listened, really listened. Each sentence the boy spoke seemed to fill a space Vance had never realized existed in his life. After a few minutes, Oliver hopped down again. Mommy, can I go look at the cars one more time? Stay where I can see you, she reminded him. I will. The boy hurried back into the toy store. The moment he disappeared through the doorway, Vance turned toward Hattie again. His voice sounded different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. You've been doing this for 4 years. Yes, every birthday. Yes, every bedtime story. Yes, and every morning before school. Hattie nodded. Vance looked toward the toy store once more. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said softly, I missed everything. Hattie's voice carried no judgment when she replied, No. And now? She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? He glanced briefly toward the phone in his pocket. Across the city, a wedding reception was already beginning. Guests were gathering. Music was playing. A bride was waiting. But suddenly none of that felt as clear as it had earlier that day. Vance looked back toward the toy store where Oliver was laughing while pushing a toy car across the floor. Then he asked the question that had quietly formed in his mind. Hattie, what happens now? For a moment after Vance asked the question, neither of them answered. The future felt uncertain, in a way Vance hadn't experienced in years. Across the mall corridor, Oliver was still kneeling inside the toy store, pushing a small red car across the floor and making quiet engine noises. The ordinary sound of a child playing felt strangely meaningful. Then Vance's phone vibrated again. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. Another message from Mitchell. The band is setting up. Lydia is asking where you are. Vance stared at the screen for a moment. The reception hall across the city was filling with people who had traveled to celebrate his wedding. Family members, business partners, friends, they were all waiting. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Hattie noticed the movement. Someone important? She asked. Yes, Vance admitted. My best man. She nodded slightly. Your reception must be starting. It probably is. For years, Vance had believed his life followed a clear direction. Build the company, expand the business, create a stable future, and eventually settle down with someone who understood the world he lived in. Earlier that afternoon, standing in the quiet church beside Lydia, that future had seemed perfectly organized. Now everything felt less certain, because sitting across from him was the woman who had supported him before success arrived. And inside the toy store was a 4-year-old boy who had just been revealed as his son. Vance rested his hands on the table. Hattie, he said slowly. Yes? Does Oliver ever ask about his father? Her expression softened slightly. Sometimes. What do you tell him? That his father lives far away. Vance absorbed the sentence quietly. Does he ask if his father will ever visit? Yes. And what do you say then? Hattie looked toward the toy store. I tell him I don't know. Just then Oliver ran back toward the table again. He was holding a small toy car in his hand. Mommy, look! He placed the car proudly on the table. This one is super fast. Vance leaned forward slightly. Let's see. Oliver pushed the car across the smooth cafe surface. It rolled quickly from one side of the table to the other. Wow, Vance said. That really is fast. Oliver grinned. I told you. He looked up at Vance again. Do you like cars? Yes. My mommy says cars help people travel to important places. That's true. Oliver nodded thoughtfully. Where were you traveling today? The question was simple, but it reminded Vance of the reality waiting for him. He glanced briefly at Hattie, then he answered, I was on my way to a party. What kind of party? A wedding celebration? Oliver brightened again. Oh, right, your wedding. Are lots of people there? Probably. Do they have balloons? Vance smiled. Maybe. Vance's phone vibrated again. This time the call appeared on the screen. Mitchell calling. Vance stared at the phone for a moment. Oliver noticed the hesitation. Are you going to answer? The boy asked. I probably should. Maybe it's important. It might be. Vance stood slowly from the table. I'll be right back. He stepped a few feet away toward the quieter side of the corridor and answered the call. Mitchell, where are you? Mitchell's voice sounded half relieved and half stressed. Everyone's here. I know. The speeches are about to start. Vance leaned against the railing overlooking the lower level of the mall. I had to stop for a moment. Mitchell sighed. Vance, Lydia's parents are asking questions. I understand. Then please tell me you're on your way. Vance didn't answer immediately. Across the corridor, he could see Oliver waving a toy car excitedly at Hattie. The boy laughed when the car rolled off the edge of the table. Mitchell spoke again. Vance? Yes. You're coming, right? Vance remained silent for several seconds. The sounds of the mall drifted around him. Footsteps, conversations, the distant music playing from the stores. Two completely different futures seemed to stand on either side of that moment. One path led back to the reception hall, a celebration already waiting for him. The other path remained here, at a cafe table, near a toy store, beside the woman who had once believed in him before anyone else did, and beside the child he had only just discovered was his son. Mitchell spoke again through the phone. Vance, we really need you here. Vance looked toward Hattie and Oliver again. Then he quietly said, Mitchell, something unexpected happened. There was a pause on the other end of the call. What kind of unexpected? Vance took a slow breath, the kind that changes everything. If you were in Vance's position right now, standing between your wedding reception and the child you just discovered was yours, what decision would you make? Tell me in the comments. And now, let's see what Vance chooses to do next. Mitchell waited on the other end of the phone. Vance? He said again. You're worrying me a little here. Vance leaned against the railing, looking down at the lower level of the mall. Shoppers moved from store to store, unaware that a man a few steps away was standing at one of the most important crossroads of his life. I know this sounds strange, Vance said quietly. Strange how? I ran into someone. Mitchell sighed. Right now? Yes, Vance, you're supposed to be arriving at your wedding reception. I know. Then who could possibly be more important than that? Vance looked across the corridor again. Oliver was now explaining something excitedly to Hattie while holding the toy car with both hands. For a moment, Vance didn't answer. Finally, he said the words carefully. Hattie. The line went silent. Mitchell clearly remembered the name. You mean the Hattie? Yes. Mitchell let out a slow breath. That's unexpected. That's one way to describe it, but that still doesn't explain why you're not heading here, Mitchell said. Vance closed his eyes briefly. There's more. Mitchell's tone shifted. What do you mean, more? Vance spoke calmly. She has a son. Okay. He's 4. Another pause. Then Mitchell said slowly, Vance, are you trying to tell me something? Yes, go on. Vance exhaled slowly before finishing the sentence. The boy is mine. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Finally, Mitchell spoke again, his voice quieter now. You're serious? Yes. You just found this out? 10 minutes ago. Mitchell let out a long breath. Well, that certainly explains the delay. Vance watched Oliver laugh as he rolled the toy car across the table again. The boy looked completely unaware that his life had just changed as well. Mitchell spoke again. So what happens now? I don't know yet. Vance, the reception hall is full of people. I'm aware. Your bride is waiting. I know. Yes. Mitchell paused again. That's a lot for one afternoon. Vance nodded slightly, even though Mitchell couldn't see him. It is. Across the cafe, Oliver had climbed back into his chair and was showing Hattie how fast the toy car could roll. Every laugh, every small movement made something inside Vance feel different. For years he had built a company that demanded every ounce of his time and energy, but watching Oliver now, he realized there had been another life growing quietly in Chicago. A life he had never known existed. Mitchell finally asked the question directly. So, what are you going to do? Vance didn't answer immediately. Instead, he returned to the table. Oliver looked up excitedly. Did your phone call finish? Yes, Vance said. Good, Oliver replied. Because I wanted to show you something. The boy pushed the toy car across the table again. This one is faster than the other one. Vance smiled. I believe you. Oliver studied him thoughtfully. Are you leaving soon for your wedding? The question landed softly. Vance glanced briefly at Hattie. Then he looked back at Oliver. I'm still deciding. Oliver nodded as if that answer made sense. Sometimes my mommy takes a long time deciding things too. Hattie laughed quietly. That's true. Oliver shrugged. It's because she wants to make the right choice. The sentence sounded simple, but it stayed in Vance's mind. The right choice. Vance stepped aside again and raised the phone to his ear. Mitchell, I'm still here. Vance took a steady breath. I need you to do something for me. Mitchell sounded cautious. What? Tell Lydia I'm not coming to the reception. Another silence followed. Vance, that's not a small decision. I know. Are you sure about this? Vance looked once more toward the toy store where Oliver had returned to explore another shelf. I'm sure. What am I supposed to tell everyone? Tell them something unexpected happened. That's the truth, Mitchell admitted. What about Lydia? Vance paused. Tell her I'm sorry. Mitchell exhaled slowly. This evening is about to become very complicated. Yes, Vance said quietly. It probably is. When Vance ended the call, he stood still for a moment. Across the cafe, Hattie watched him carefully. She had seen the seriousness in his expression. When he returned to the table, she spoke gently. You look like you just made a very difficult decision. I did. Oliver looked up again. Are you going to your party now? Vance pulled out the chair and sat down beside them. No, he said softly. Oliver blinked. Why not? Vance smiled at him. Because I realize there's somewhere else I need to be tonight. Oliver considered the answer carefully. Then he asked the most natural question in the world. Where? Vance looked toward Hattie. then back at the boy. Right here. When Vance sat back down at the cafe table, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. Hattie had noticed the seriousness in his expression when he returned from the phone call. She had seen the pause before he spoke to Oliver. She understood that whatever had just happened was important. Oliver, on the other hand, seemed focused on something else entirely. He was carefully placing his toy car on the table and lining it up beside Captain Bear as if organizing a small parade. "Now they're friends," he announced. "That's good," Vance said with a smile. "Friends are important." Oliver nodded seriously. "My mommy says that too." Hattie glanced toward Vance. "So," she said gently, "did you need to go back to the reception?" Vance met her eyes calmly. "No." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "No. I told my best man I wouldn't be coming tonight." For a moment, she simply stared at him. "You left your own reception?" "Yes, Vance." Her voice carried surprise, but also concern. "That's not a small decision." "I know." Hattie leaned back slightly in her chair, trying to process what he had said. "Your bride must be wondering where you are." "She probably is. And the guests?" "They'll manage." She studied him carefully. "Why did you do that?" Vance glanced toward Oliver, who was now making quiet engine sounds while pushing his toy car across the table. Then he answered honestly, "Because I just discovered I have a son." Hattie didn't interrupt. "And for 4 years," he continued, "I had no idea he existed." She lowered her gaze briefly. "I know." Vance's voice remained calm. "I can't change those 4 years. No, but I can decide what I do next." Hattie folded her hands together on the table. "You're not obligated to change your life because of this." "I'm not thinking about obligation," he replied. "Then what are you thinking about?" Vance looked toward Oliver again. "Opportunity." Oliver had now begun explaining something to Captain Bear in great detail. Apparently the toy car was preparing for a very important race across the cafe table. Vance watched him with quiet interest. "I've built companies," he said thoughtfully. "I've solved complicated problems. I've negotiated deals worth millions of dollars." Hattie listened. "It is," she agreed softly. Vance rested his arms lightly on the table. When he laughed a few minutes ago, he said, "I realized something strange." "What?" "I've never heard my own son laugh before today." The sentence was simple, but it carried deep meaning. Hattie looked down for a moment. "You didn't miss it because you didn't care," she said gently. "You missed it because I never told you." "That may be true," Vance replied, "but now that I know," he paused briefly, "I don't want to miss anything else." Hattie's expression softened, but there was still caution in her eyes. "Vance, Oliver has lived a stable life. I'm glad he has. He's happy, that's clear. And he doesn't know anything about you yet." "I understand." She leaned slightly forward. "I need to be careful with his world. You should be. Children need consistency." "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "What exactly are you hoping for here?" Vance answered honestly. "I don't expect to step into his life overnight. That would be impossible anyway. I just want the chance to be part of it." Hattie thought about the request. "That's not something I can decide instantly. I'm not asking you to." "Good," she said gently. "Because trust takes time." Vance nodded. "I'm willing to give it time." Just then Oliver looked up again. "Mommy, yes? Can we go to the toy store now?" Hattie smiled. "I thought you already explored it. I want to look again." "Of course you do." Oliver turned toward Vance. "Do you want to come too?" The invitation was casual. A simple request from a child who had just met someone interesting. But for Vance, it felt like something much bigger. She hesitated for only a second before giving a small nod. Vance smiled at Oliver. "I'd like that." Oliver jumped down from his chair excitedly. "Come on." He grabbed Captain Bear and ran toward the toy store entrance. Vance stood beside Hattie for a moment before following Oliver. She looked at him carefully. "You know this won't be easy," she said quietly. "I know. There will be questions. I expect that. And emotions. I understand." She took a slow breath. "Oliver's world has been simple until now. Then we'll keep it simple," Vance said. Hattie studied his face for a moment. "You seem very calm for someone who just walked away from his wedding reception." Vance gave a thoughtful smile. "Sometimes life gives you exactly one moment to realize what really matters. And you think this is that moment?" He looked toward the toy store where Oliver was already pointing excitedly at a row of toy airplanes. "Yes," Vance said softly. "I think it might be." Then, without another word, the two of them walked toward the toy store, where a 4-year-old boy was waiting eagerly to show his new friend the fastest toy car in the world. Inside the toy store, Oliver moved quickly from one shelf to another, pointing out everything he found exciting. "This one flies," he said, lifting a small toy airplane. And this robot talks. Each discovery seemed just as important as the last. Vance followed a few steps behind him, smiling at the boy's endless enthusiasm. For someone who had spent years sitting through serious meetings and carefully planned business presentations, the experience felt refreshingly simple. Oliver stopped beside a display of miniature trains. "Do you like trains?" he asked. "I do," Vance replied. "My grandpa likes them too. That sounds like a good thing to have in common." Oliver nodded, satisfied with that answer. Hattie watched from nearby, quietly observing the interaction between them. There was something natural about the way Oliver spoke to Vance. Children often sense when someone is genuinely paying attention to them, and Vance was doing exactly that. For the first time since the conversation in the cafe, Hattie allowed herself to relax slightly. After exploring the store for nearly 20 minutes, Oliver finally chose 2 items, the fast red toy car and Captain Bear, who had now officially become part of the adventure. When they reached the counter, Oliver looked at his mother. "Can I get both?" Hattie hesitated slightly. "You already have many toys at home, but these ones are special." Vance reached for his wallet. "Let me help with that." Hattie shook her head gently. "You don't need to do that." "I know," Vance replied, "but I'd like to." Oliver watched the exchange curiously. "Is he allowed to buy toys?" he asked. Hattie smiled faintly. "Yes, Oliver, he's allowed." The cashier rang up the purchase, and Oliver received the bag with excitement. "Thank you," he said happily. "You're welcome," Vance replied. For Vance, the moment felt small compared to the business deals he handled every day, but somehow it also felt far more meaningful. When they stepped outside the mall, evening had settled over the city. Streetlights had begun to glow, and the air carried the comfortable coolness of early night. Oliver walked between them, holding the bag with his new treasures. "Mommy, can we stop for ice cream?" he asked. Hattie laughed. "You just had hot chocolate." "But that was earlier." Vance smiled. "I think that sounds like a good idea." Oliver looked up at him with wide eyes. "You like ice cream too?" "Very much." A small ice cream shop stood just across the parking lot. As they walked toward it, Vance realized something. The evening he had expected to spend giving speeches and greeting hundreds of guests had turned into something entirely different. A quiet walk across a parking lot with his son, and somehow the simplicity felt exactly right. They sat at a small outdoor table with 3 cups of ice cream. Oliver's had bright sprinkles on top. Vance listened as the boy described his preschool class. "My teacher says I ask too many questions," Oliver explained. "That's not a bad thing," Vance said. "Why?" "Because curious people often learn the most." Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "My mommy says that too." Hattie smiled at the familiar phrase. "You're very lucky," Vance added. "Why?" Oliver asked. "You have a mother who teaches you good things." Oliver looked proud. "I know." Then he pointed his spoon toward Vance. "Do you work with computers?" "Yes. My mommy works with numbers. That sounds important." Oliver took another bite of ice cream. "Maybe one day I'll work with trains." "That would be great," Vance replied. The conversation moved easily. No pressure, no expectations, just simple moments. After finishing their ice cream, Oliver climbed into the back seat of Hattie's car. Captain Bear sat beside him like a trusted passenger. Vance stood beside the driver's door with Hattie. The night air felt calm. "You didn't have to stay this evening," she said quietly. "I wanted to. You changed a lot of plans today." "I did." "Do you regret it?" Vance looked toward the back seat where Oliver was making quiet car noises with his toy. "No," he said. "Not even a little." Hattie studied his expression carefully. "You realize this isn't going to be simple. I know. There will be conversations with Lydia." "Yes." "And many other things. I understand." She nodded slowly. "But Oliver smiled a lot tonight. That matters." "Yes," she said softly. "It does." Before Hattie got into the car, Vance leaned slightly closer. "I know trust takes time," he said. "It does. And I know I missed the first 4 years." Hattie remained silent. "But if you allow it," he continued, "I'd like to be part of the next ones." She considered the words carefully. Finally, she nodded. "We'll take it one step at a time." "That's fair." From the back seat, Oliver leaned forward. "Are you coming with us tomorrow?" he asked. Vance smiled. "Maybe." "Good," Oliver said, "because Captain Bear likes you." Vance laughed softly. "Well then, I'll try not to disappoint Captain Bear." Hattie started the engine. As the car pulled away, Oliver waved enthusiastically through the window. Vance stood in the parking lot watching them disappear into the evening traffic. But sometimes life quietly rearranges everything. And in that unexpected change, a completely different future begins. For many years, Vance Keebler believed success meant building something impressive, a thriving company, a respected reputation, a future filled with opportunities, and in many ways, he achieved all of those goals. But standing alone in the parking lot that evening, he realized something important. Success is not always measured by what we build. Sometimes it is measured by the people who walk beside us while we build it. Life has a strange way of bringing unfinished stories back to us, not always at convenient moments, not always when we expect them, but often exactly when we need them. For Vance, that moment happened in the middle of an ordinary shopping mall, a place he had entered only to clear his thoughts before a wedding reception. Instead, he discovered something far more meaningful, a son he never knew, and a chance to rebuild a connection he once believed was lost forever. The road ahead would not be simple. There would be difficult conversations, complicated emotions, and many adjustments for everyone involved. But one thing had already changed. Vance was no longer walking through life alone. Somewhere in Chicago, a 4-year-old boy was probably showing Captain Bear his new toy car before bedtime, and that boy now had a father who finally knew he existed. Sometimes we spend years chasing the future we believe we want, only to discover that the most important parts of life were quietly waiting for us all along. And when life gives us the chance to notice them, the bravest choice is simply to show up. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime for more meaningful stories about life, love, and second chances. And tell me in the comments, do you believe life gives us second chances, or do we have to create them ourselves?